During shopping, my 8-year-old clutched my hand and said, "Mom, quickly, to the bathroom." In the stall, she whispered, "Don't move." Look, I bent down and froze in horror. I didn't cry. I took action. 3 hours later, my mother-in-law went pale because I used to laugh at kids' fears. Not out loud, not cruelly, just the quiet, adult kind of amusement. Sitting here with my coffee, watching the world go by, I'm struck by how quickly peace can vanish. Where are you joining us from? And what's your favorite drink right now? I look forward to your comments. Let's go back to that Sunday when a simple transaction was replaced by clinical focus. As a pediatric surgeon, I have spent my entire adult life operating in a world of clinical certainty. I do not deal in maybe, or I think so. I deal in millimeters, heart rates, and blood oxygen levels. My world is a balance sheet of biological survival. When you spend 12 hours a day looking at the human heart as a pump that needs fixing, rather than a metaphor for poetry, you lose the ability to panic. You trade your tears for a scalpel-like focus. You learn that in an emergency, the one who screams is the one who dies. The one who calculates is the one who walks out of the theatre. That Sunday was supposed to be a simple transaction. A shopping trip for a charity gala. I viewed the event as a necessary professional expense, a social tax I had to pay to keep my department funded. Sophie, my 8-year-old, was my only anchor in a life that often felt like a series of back-to-back shifts. She was growing fast. Her innocence, the only thing I hadn't yet categorized as a line item in my ledger of responsibilities. She had picked out a blue dress. It was bright, vibrant, and entirely too expensive. But I didn't care. I viewed it as a dividend for the long hours I spent away from her. But as we walked through the marble corridors of that high-end boutique, something felt off. My internal alarm, the one that usually tells me a patient is about to crash before the monitors even beep, began to hum. It was a subtle friction in the air, a shadow that didn't belong to the mannequins. I ignored it at first. I told myself I was just overworked, that my bones felt borrowed, and my mind was playing tricks. Then, Sophie's grip tightened. It wasn't the playful tug of a child wanting a toy. It was the white-knuckled grab of a patient in shock. She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes forward, her voice a low, urgent vibration that bypassed my ears and went straight to my spine. "Mom!" Quickly. To the bathroom. I didn't ask why. I didn't offer her a snack or tell her to wait. I catalogued her pupils dilated, her breathing shallow. She was in a state of high physiological stress. I followed her lead into the restroom, the heavy mahogany door clicking shut behind us with an air of finality. We entered the large handicap stall, the most spacious one at the end of the row. The luxury of the place was nauseating, the gold-plated fixtures, the scent of expensive lilies, the absolute silence. Then came her whisper. "Don't move. Look." I didn't hesitate. I lowered my center of gravity, crouching on the cold, polished floor. I looked through the gap under the stall door. And that's when the world shifted from a shopping trip to a crime scene. A pair of polished black shoes, Oxford style, high-end, the kind worn by men who handle other people's money, stopped directly in front of our door. They weren't moving toward a sink. They weren't looking for a stall. They were positioned with the stillness of a hunter. Then, a voice. It was low, calm, and disturbingly professional. It was the voice of a man giving a weather report or reading a grocery list, but he was speaking into a phone, and his words were a surgical strike against my safety. "Yeah, mother and daughter. The girl's about 8. They've got shopping bags. Blue dress. I will keep tracking their movement." The realization hit me with the force of a cardiac arrest. The blue dress. We had purchased it less than 10 minutes ago. It was tucked inside the heavy paper bag currently resting against my knees. This wasn't a random predator. This wasn't the stranger danger they warn you about in school. This was a targeted audit. Someone wasn't just following me. They were documenting my life in real time. They were identifying my daughter by the very things I had just bought for her. I felt the familiar coldness wash over me, the surgical calm. My heart didn't race. My vision didn't blur. Instead, My brain began to process the data points like a diagnostic computer. Man, dark suit, professional shoes, using a phone as a surveillance tool, identifying clothes. The conclusion was inevitable. I wasn't being reviewed. I was being hunted by a professional tracker. My life was under a microscope, and the person holding the lens was someone who knew exactly where I would be. I looked at Sophie. Her eyes were huge, reflecting a terror I had always tried to shield her from. I put my finger to my lips, mimicking her earlier gesture. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, the way they are when I'm tying off an artery. I hit the voice memo app. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen. That is the first rule of medicine. And it was now the first rule of my survival. I captured every word he said. They should have come this way if they didn't leave already. Yeah, I will keep looking. I listened to the creak of the other stall doors as he checked them one by one. He had time. He was patient. He was a professional. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I just watched those polished black shoes through the gap, calculating the distance to the door and the exact number of seconds it would take to reach the security desk. I realized in that moment that the quiet, adult amusement I used to feel regarding childhood fears was a luxury I would never have again. The monsters under the bed had graduated to bespoke suits and corporate contracts. My mother-in-law, Kimberly, had always been the noisy critic in my life. She viewed my career as a surgeon not as a noble calling, but as a series of documented failures in traditional motherhood. She had been asking Sophie strange questions lately, measuring questions. Is your mom home much? Does she leave you alone while she works those long shifts? I had treated it as the annoying static of an overbearing grandmother. I hadn't realized it was the opening movement of a hostile takeover. The man outside moved toward the sinks. I heard the water run a cover for his presence. That was my window. We slipped out of that marble trap like smoke, fast, silent, and without leaving a trace. My hands were locked onto Sophie's, our expensive shopping bags clutched against us like shields as we moved through the bright, predatory glare of the mall. My medical training dictated my movement. I was prioritizing the exit the way I prioritize a patient's airway. Nothing else mattered until the environment was stabilized. Security was a 5-minute sprint away. The guard behind the desk had a face made of bored routines and half-eaten sandwiches. He saw a woman in a designer suit and an 8-year-old with wild eyes, and immediately reached for his customer service mask. He expected a lost credit card or a complaint about a bathroom stall that was out of soap. "We are being followed," I said. My voice did not waver. It was the same tone I used to tell a surgical team that a bleeder was out of control. A man in the ladies' lounge, polished black shoes, dark suit. He is documenting our purchases over the phone. The guard started to give me a skeptical smile. The kind men give women they think are being dramatic. I didn't give him the chance to speak. I unlocked my phone and hit play on the recording. Marcus's voice filled the small office, cold and clinical. The girl is about 8. They have got shopping bags, blue dress. The guard's skepticism evaporated in 1.5 seconds. Documentation is the only truth in a world of variables. If it isn't recorded, it didn't happen. But this was now an undeniable fact on a digital ledger. Security tracked the shoes. They found Marcus 30 minutes later near the valet stand, looking more like a banker than a predator. He didn't run. He just flashed a high-end private investigator's badge and spoke about surveillance protocols and custody-related background checks. As a surgeon, I am a mandatory reporter. I don't ignore threats. Before I even looked at the audit, I had secured an emergency restraining order. Marcus and Kimberly were legally forbidden from being within 500 feet of Sophie by sunset. The gala wasn't about safety that was already handled. The gala was about the truth. By the time we reached the police station, the fluorescent lights felt like they were scrubbing the skin off my bones. I sat Sophie down with a cup of water, watching her breathing return to a normal rhythm. I was already calculating the legal repercussions, my mind running through a checklist of protective orders and privacy violations. Then, the door to the waiting room swung open. Tyler, my brother-in-law, burst in with the velocity of someone who had been waiting for the signal. He was a financial analyst, a man who lived in the margins of other people's wealth. He looked pale, breathless, his expensive cologne battling the sterile smell of the precinct. Olivia! I saw a post on a private group chat. Something about a stalker at the mall. I thought it might be you, he gasped, reaching out for a hug. I stepped back. I didn't want a hug. I wanted the data bridge. How did you get here so fast, Tyler? It has been less than an hour since we left the store. I was just nearby, he stammered. I looked at him the way I look at a suspicious mass on an ultrasound. Give me your phone. What? Olivia, I am trying to help. The phone, Tyler. Now. He handed it over, his fingers trembling. I didn't scroll through his photos. I went straight to his messages. There, at the top of the list, was a thread with Kimberly, my mother-in-law. The last message sent 5 minutes ago read, "Target is at the station. Auditor is being questioned. Do not let her see the folder." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply took a screenshot and sent it to my own device. I realized then that my mother-in-law hadn't just hired a man to watch us. She had turned my own family into a surveillance network. This wasn't about worrying for a grieving widow. It was a high-stakes legacy audit. And Kimberly Miller had just made a fatal error in her accounting. I used to think survival was a loud, dramatic event, the kind involving sirens and cinematic reunions. But as a pediatric surgeon, I know the truth. Survival is quiet. It is the steady hum of a ventilator and the clinical precision of a hand that refuses to shake even when the patient is crashing. After my husband David died in that car crash 2 years ago, my life stopped being a story and became a series of audited spreadsheets. I worked 12-hour shifts at the hospital, the kind of shifts where you come home and your bones feel borrowed, like you are walking around in a frame that doesn't quite belong to you anymore. I turned our grief into a routine. School pickups, hospital charts, and spaghetti nights. Because that was the one thing David knew how to cook. I was the silent provider, the one performing the surgeries and paying the premiums to maintain the $2,500,000 trust fund that would ensure Sophie's future. David had named Kimberly as a co-trustee of the fund, a gesture of family unity that I had never challenged. She believed that title gave her a blank check. She didn't realize that in the world of high-stakes finance, a co-trustee's signature is a tracker, not a permission slip to steal. Kimberly, on the other hand, was the noisy critic. She was a socialite who measured motherhood by the crispness of a linen apron rather than the depth of a college fund. Lately, her interest in us had taken on a sharp, measuring edge. She would ask Sophie if school was hard, if I was home enough, or if I left her alone too often. She said it tasted like concern, but to a surgeon trained to spot an infection, it tasted like a diagnostic test for a hostile takeover. People might ask why I didn't push back sooner, why I let her audit my schedule and interrogate my daughter. They don't understand the invisible chain of a survivor. In a high-stakes trauma environment, you learn that your silence isn't a sign of weakness. It is a tactical choice. This invisible chain is a psychological cage that victims of long-term scrutiny build to protect what little they have left. I wasn't being submissive. I was holding the perimeter. You don't pick a fight with a predator while you are still suturing your own wounds. I was waiting for the moment when my hands were steady enough to operate on the family cancer that was Kimberly Miller. I looked at Tyler's phone, the text message from Kimberly still glowing like a toxic spill. Do not let her see the folder. This was no longer about a grieving grandmother's overstepping. It was a calculated hunt for my daughter's inheritance. Kimberly wanted me to look unstable, overworked, and negligent, so she could trigger the succession clause and seize control of the $2,500,000. I stood there in the police station, surrounded by the smell of floor wax and stale coffee, and I felt the last link of that invisible chain snap. The daughter-in-law who stayed quiet to keep the peace was dead. The surgeon who cuts out the rot was finally taking over the case. This wasn't going to be an emotional breakdown. It was going to be an accounting. And in my world, when the numbers do not add up, someone loses their license to exist in my life. The hallway didn't smell like memories anymore. It smelled like the cold, antiseptic reality of a war zone. I was still processing the digital trail I'd found on Tyler's phone when the doorbell rang. It was 8 o'clock on a Tuesday, the exact time Kimberly used to drop by to check in on the girl David left behind. In my old life, I would have opened the door with a tired smile, grateful for the help. In this one, I checked the security feed first. I opened the door and found her standing there, a vision of polished granite and expensive cashmere. She didn't ask to come in. She just stepped across the threshold, as if my home were a satellite office of her own empire. She looked at me with that exaggerated, maternal tilt of her head, the one that usually preceded a lecture on my surgical exhaustion. "Olivia, darling," she said, her voice like velvet stretched over barbed wire. "I have been thinking about what happened at the mall. It is clear the stress of your 12-hour shifts is finally catching up with you. You are seeing monsters where there are only shadows." I didn't invite her to sit. I remained standing, my posture as rigid as a surgical table. "I am not seeing shadows, Kimberly. I am seeing data, and the data suggests I am being tracked." She sighed, a practiced sound of socialite disappointment. "This is exactly what I mean. Your emotional volatility is starting to impact Sophie. David would be so concerned. He always said you were brilliant, but high-strung. He would want me to take more of a lead now." She reached into her designer bag and produced a keychain with a single, expectant hook. "Give me a spare key, Olivia, just in case. For the child's safety, David would want me to have access if you fail to answer." I looked at the key and then at her. This was the trap of normalized cruelty. People like Kimberly do not usually start with a crime. They start with a favor. They market control as care and surveillance as safety, until the victim is so entangled they cannot tell the difference between a hug and a chokehold. By weaponizing David's name, she was trying to trigger a guilt-based subscription to her authority. But my compassion for her grief had been an interest-free loan, and I was calling it in. "My neighbor Valerie has helped us for years, and she's never demanded a key," I said, my voice clinical and flat. "Do not use my dead husband as leverage to bypass my boundaries." The answer is no. Kimberly's face hardened. The maternal tilt disappeared, replaced by a sharp, predatory focus. "You are being unreasonable, perhaps even unstable. It is a lot for a judge to look at a mother who works 80 hours a week, who has a history of emotional stress, and who shuts out the only stable family her daughter has left." That was the move. She was previewing the resume contest she planned to present in court, the one where my career was a liability, and her clean, structured environment was the prize. "Grandma, you're being scary." Sophie was standing in the doorway of the kitchen, her homework folder clutched to her chest. She didn't look like a child seeking a cookie. She looked like a witness providing a statement. For a split second, Kimberly's mask didn't just crack, it shattered. Her face twisted into something hungry and dark. A flash of pure, unadulterated anger that Sophie had dared to interrupt her audit. Then, with a speed that was almost terrifying, she smoothed her features back into a smile. "Scary grandma just wants to protect you, sweetheart," she said sweetly. But Sophie moved behind me, using my frame as a shield. Her instinct knew what my grief had tried to deny. Kimberly wasn't there to save us. She was there to claim the assets. "I think you should leave now," I said, opening the door wide. Kimberly walked past me, pausing just long enough to whisper, "This is not over, Olivia. You cannot audit your way out of a grandmother's love." I didn't respond. I just locked the door and watched the security feed until her car cleared the driveway. This wasn't a family dispute anymore. It was a hostile takeover, and I was about to look at the books. I sat in my study, the glow of my laptop screen, the only thing cutting through the darkness. My mind, usually occupied by heart rates and blood oxygen levels, was now performing a different kind of surgery, a diagnostic review of my own life. I thought about Marcus, the man with the polished black shoes. He wasn't just a stranger following us. He was a specialist in legal sabotage, a private investigator hired to trigger a succession clause by any means necessary. She needed a recorded tantrum, a late school pickup, or a single moment of surgical exhaustion that she could label as negligence to activate the clause in Sophie's $2,500,000 trust. For years, I had maintained the contract of the polite daughter-in-law. I had been a silent investor in their version of a happy family. Every Monday morning, like a sacred ritual, I would send a selection of rare teas to Kimberly's condo. A small, submissive gesture of respect. I paid like a subscription fee. I stopped the ritual today. I didn't send the tea. I didn't answer her frantic texts. The contract was officially breached. I realized that my compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, and the account was now closed. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. I simply opened my laptop and started clicking. I didn't need a shoulder to cry on. I needed a scalpel for my finances. I called a high-end forensic accountant, a man who dealt in the same kind of cold certainty I used in the operating theatre. I gave him full access to the $2,500,000 trust fund. I wasn't just defending my parenting anymore. I was auditing the auditor. As I waited for the preliminary results, I looked at a photo of Kimberly at a charity gala, draped in diamonds and entitlement. This is the illusion of the empty wallet. Elite socialites like Kimberly often operate from a position that is rented, not owned. Their power is a performance sustained by money they did not earn and titles they cannot defend. Kimberly's elite status was merely a mask paid for by my daughter's legacy. I realized that when the money disappears, these people do not just lose their wealth, they lose their character. Because there was never any foundation beneath the mask to begin with. She was a house of cards, built on my husband's death and my daughter's future. I hadn't just called my forensic accountant that night. I had opened a quiet investigation months ago. The moment the first clerical error appeared in Sophie's statements. The 3 a.m. report wasn't the start of the hunt. It was the autopsy of a long-term fraud. The final smoking gun had just been delivered. The accountant's first report hit my inbox at 3 a.m. It was a cold sunrise made of facts and numbers. There were red flags on the withdrawal history patterns that did not match Sophie's needs or my husband's instructions. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a feeling of betrayal, but there was only clarity. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a balance sheet. Kimberly thought she was auditing my motherhood, but she had forgotten one thing. I am a surgeon. I know how to cut out the rot without damaging the healthy tissue. I spent the rest of the night preparing my own evidence folder. Inside, it did not contain photos of neglect. It contained proof of theft. My father-in-law used to say that family comes first, but I was about to prove that in my house, the truth comes first. Calm, factual, lethal. The silence of the house felt heavy, like the pressure in an artery right before it bursts. I sat in the blue glow of my monitors, scrolling through the forensic report and autopsy of a theft that had been happening right under my nose. The numbers did not lie, and they certainly did not care about family bonds. There was a hole in Sophie's trust fund, a $400,000 void that no amount of market fluctuation could explain. I looked at the digital scans of the withdrawal slips. My name was at the bottom of each one, written in a hand that tried to mimic my surgical precision, but lacked the steady muscle memory. The strokes were jagged and desperate. Kimberly hadn't just been auditing my motherhood. She had been forging my identity. She had siphoned $400,000 to settle her own gambling debts and maintain the illusion of the empty wallet. The pristine socialite facade she used to look down on me. The realization was a diagnostic breakthrough. Marcus, the man with the polished shoes, wasn't just a stalker. He was a hired gun for character assassination. His job at the mall was to document a moment of instability, a recorded outburst, or a sign of neglect that Kimberly could use to explain why $400,000 had gone missing under my volatile watch. She was preparing to frame me for her own heist. I was meant to be the fall girl for her addiction, losing my daughter and my career so she could keep her townhouse. I sat back and let the horror of a world without a witness wash over me. If Sophie hadn't sensed the shadow behind us, if I hadn't crouched on that tacky bathroom floor to look through the gap and record Marcus, Kimberly's trap would have snapped shut. I would have walked into a courtroom where Marcus's surveillance and her forged slips were already waiting to destroy me. I would have lost everything. To a woman who called her theft grandmotherly love. It was a near miss on a lethal scale, a tragedy avoided by a single point of data. But the balance sheet had finally flipped. I had the forensic proof of the signature mismatches, ink analysis, and pressure points that proved the forgery was Kimberly's work. My compassion for her grief had been an interest-free loan she had defaulted on for the last time. There were no more maybes left in my ledger. I did not feel sadness or a need to scream. A surgeon does not feel emotional when they find the source of an infection. They feel ready to operate. I compiled the evidence, the mall recording, Tyler's incriminating texts, and the report on the $400,000 deficit. I wasn't just going to defend my home. I was going to perform a total excision of the rot. The charity gala was in 48 hours, the stage where Kimberly expected to be the guest of honor. I decided to give her exactly what she wanted. A public performance she would never forget. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. And I was coming to collect every cent of the debt. The ballroom was a sea of crystal, silk, and a suffocating amount of artificial charm. It was the night of the charity gala, the exact environment Kimberly used to validate her existence. She was in her element, holding a glass of vintage champagne and surrounded by donors who believed her performance of the supportive matriarch. I stood at the edge of the room, my own silk dress feeling like armor. I wasn't there to socialize. I was there to perform a final excision. I watched as Kimberly took the small stage to accept an award for her charitable contributions. She adjusted the microphone, a well-practiced, tearful smile on her face. "My son David loved this hospital," she began, her voice quivering with a grief that I now knew was a marketing tool. "And in his absence, my only goal has been to ensure his legacy and his daughter's future are protected. It has not been easy, helping a family that is struggling to find its footing after such a loss." The room hummed with collective sympathy. I could see Tyler standing near the front, looking at the floor. He knew what was coming. I didn't wait for her to finish. I walked toward the stage, my heels clicking against the marble with a rhythm that cut through her saccharine monologue. The audience went silent. Kimberly's smile faltered as I stepped up beside her. "Olivia, darling," she whispered, her eyes darting to the crowd. "This is not the time." "Actually, Kimberly, this is the perfect time for an audit," I said. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the same volume I use when announcing a time of death. I handed her a heavy manila folder. "This is the forensic report for my daughter's $2,500,000 trust fund." She did not open it. She just clutched it against her chest. "What are you doing? You are making a scene." "No, I am documenting a crime," I replied, turning to face the donors and investors. The folder contains bank records showing a $400,000 deficit. It turns out that while you were hiring illegal surveillance teams to hunt me in a public restroom, you were the one siphoning my daughter's future. The silence that followed was absolute. I could feel the social status Kimberly had spent 40 years building evaporate in a single breath. The illusion of the empty wallet was shattered. She was no longer a benefactor. She was a suspect. The officers standing by the entrance weren't there for the atmosphere. I had spent my afternoon at the precinct, handing over a digital trail of forged signatures and unauthorized transfers. A judge had signed the warrant by 5 p.m. The gala wasn't a trial. It was just the most public place to execute the arrest. 2 uniformed officers moved to the edge of the stage. Kimberly went pale, her cashmere-clad frame finally looking as fragile as her lies. "You called my motherhood a resume contest, Kimberly," I whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "You said I was volatile because I chose to save lives instead of attending your lunches. But in the world of accounting, facts do not care about your social standing. You have defaulted on every bond of family we had. You are fired." The power flip was decisive. She did not beg for forgiveness, not then. She was too busy realizing that the police were her only remaining audience. I didn't stay to watch her be escorted out. I had a daughter waiting at home. Transitions are funny things. They do not always look like a ticking clock. Sometimes, they look like the changing of a lock. 3 months later, the only sound in my morning was the wind off the lake and the distant call of a heron. Kimberly had been exiled to a small condo in another state. Her contact with Sophie legally restricted to supervised, structured calls. The law had finally audited her love. Tyler had earned his way back, slow and quiet. He did not ask for access. He just showed up to help me clear the weeds in the garden David had loved. He told Sophie stories about her father as a boy, keeping his memory real without trying to replace him. Some nights we sat at the kitchen table with tea and silence. Not romantic, not yet, just human. I started seeing him as a person again, not a role, just a human who had been tricked and was now doing the work to fix it. Sitting on the balcony of our lake cabin, I realized that I had finally reclaimed my worth. I had stopped trying to make myself smaller to fit their expectations. I had learned that love that demands an audit isn't love, it is surveillance. I have come to realize that the most powerful thing a person can do is define their own value, independent of a family's ledger. If you find yourself in a similar situation, remember this. You do not owe your peace to people who treat your survival like a competition. Forgiveness is not always for the other person. Sometimes it is the only way to set yourself free. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. If this story gave you the courage to change your own locks, let me know in the comments. Your peace is non-negotiable. Hit like, subscribe, and stay sovereign.